Last week we started on this new section of history of the churches, the Budding of Apostasy, the years approximately A.D. 100 to A.D. 700. And so once the apostolic age came to an end, there were already seeds of apostasy being planted during the apostolic age. And the budding of apostasy, then the seeds started to sprout. And they started to grow a little more, and they got buds on them, and then the fruit blossoms. And by the way, it's important to keep in mind, that's how things work in life. That is often how things work as far as trends and a direction of things, is nothing just pops up. Nothing just pops up overnight. When we think about, just as I was talking about these executive orders and things coming from the government, those things didn't just pop up overnight. The seeds of those things were planted many, many years ago. The only reason that the governor can do what he's doing right now is because of a law that was passed in 1950, state of emergency law. And then there was another one that was added to it regarding pandemics back in, I think, 2008 or 2009. The Massachusetts legislature passed a law regarding pandemics that gives the governor a lot of power in the state of emergency when there's a pandemic. And that is what it's all based upon, is that. So 1950, now that, whoever thought, 1950 when that's passed, that, 70 years later, exactly 70 years later, that this would be the case, that this would be where we're at. I don't think those were the original intentions of state of emergency laws. I think that had more to do with wartime. But when it comes to the government's eyes, we're at war with this virus. So they get people in a war mentality for that. But the point is that things don't happen just out of nowhere. There are seeds that are planted. Then they sprout. And then they start to bud and get the fruit. They get the leaves, they get the fruit. And it takes a long time. And that's why it takes a long time then. It can take some time to set things right if there are certain things and systems that have been in motion for a long time. If things need to be set right, it's not always just snap a finger and then all of a sudden everything changes. And so it was in the churches, is that these seeds got planted, and now almost 2,000 years later, look at where we're at with churches and religions. Look at all the sprouts, all the fruit that has come from these seeds of apostasy that were planted so many years ago. And so what we're tracking is the gradual move and shift into a position or more of a trend toward apostasy. And so last week we focused on corruption of baptism. We're not going to go through all that. But basically, baptism was changed from a sign of repentance and faith to a means of becoming a Christian. Then later on, that led to children being baptized. Then later on, infant baptism became much more common. So what started as you got to be baptized to be saved, and then children being baptized, and then it becomes more and more common. And then before you know it, the government is requiring it. And forcing people, the pagan countries, the peoples that they took over and conquered, they would force them to be baptized, and that was kind of their initiation into the empire, into the kingdom. And so a lot of this, when it comes to the apostate church, a lot of it was more political than it was spiritual, religious. But when you have the combination, anytime you have the combination of politics, political, and the religious, as far as in a religious institution, it is a recipe for trouble. I'm not even for Christians as far as churches like, we need to take over the United States government. Now, we need a Christian influence in government, but there should not be an unholy alliance between church and state. And it doesn't matter what church it is, there shouldn't be an alliance between an organized religion or church and the state. I'm all for, I think in our country right now, there's been the precedent from our founding that we recognize that there is a creator, that there is a God. That is not an unholy, just the government recognizing and operating on the premise that there is a God, a creator God, is not an unholy alliance between church and state. That is not the same thing. So what we're going to get into now is the corruption of church government. There was a corruption of church government. So you get the corruption of baptism, and then you get the corruption of church government. Now see if this sounds familiar. Not just among churches, but just among the trends in the world. This quote here, this is from John Christian, a historian. There was a constant tendency toward centralization. Isn't that the way the world works? Constant tendency toward centralization. By the way, back in Genesis at the Tower of Babel, there was a tendency toward centralization. And the Lord split that up. Well, do you think the devil changes his playbook as far as what his end goals are? No, it's easier to rule over a people or a world if there is centralization. As the pastor assumed rights which were not granted to him by the Scriptures, some of the metropolitan pastors exercised an undue authority over some of the smaller churches. Then the churches in some of the cities sought the patronage and protection of the pastors of the larger cities. Finally, Rome, the political center of the world, became the religious center as well. In time, the pastor in Rome became the universal pope. All of this was of slow growth and required centuries for its consummation. Notice that. It was of slow growth and required centuries for its consummation. Now notice, thinking about it from just a governmental perspective here in America, our country is well over 200 years old. And we still have some level of decentralization, but as time goes on, things become more and more centralized. More and more centralized. We have, although right now with our current president, the government doesn't change as far as how the nature of government, the size of government does not change with our current president, or no matter who's president for that matter. But when it comes to even the response to the coronavirus, there are some ways of the response that have been centralized, but there have been a lot of the responses that have been left to individual states, which in this case I think has been a blessing. It's been a good thing for the most part. And it's better because not all states are the same. Now, we might disagree with what one state does compared to another, but at the very least, you have at least a chance that if, let's say you want to go visit another state, well, they might have some different regulations in effect than the state you live in. So at least that's one benefit. But all of this was of slow growth and required centuries for its consummation, and that is what is happening in governments all across the world. You have the European Union, that is a centralization, and you have and that was of slow growth as well. That started off as an economic partnership, and then went into more of a political type of partnership. So that happened gradually, and one of the very tenets and fundamental truths or reasons of why or what it means to be a Baptist is the lack of centralization. That every church is autonomous. Now that doesn't mean that churches can't go to other churches and have fellowship with them, or even that doesn't mean one pastor can't go and ask advice of other pastors. But it means as we are not going to band together as far as a formal organization with a hierarchy that rules over these churches. That is a fundamental Bible truth of the autonomy of the church. But that was the opposite direction of the apostate church. So we see here that pastors first exercised excessive authority within their congregations. So it starts off small, all right? So you get a ruler. Now, we have two different things, and I think I might have talked about this in the last couple of weeks, but there's two different aspects of the direction of churches. And we see that both of those today. We see one is the hierarchy, the denominational hierarchy, and the power and the lording over the people. And then that would be the the Nicolaitans, spoken of in the book of Revelation, which, power over the people. So you have two classes. You have the clergy, you have the clergy and the laity. Two classes. You have the reverends. I don't even like the term reverend because, God's name is reverend. We should be revering God's name. Now, I think the pastoral office is one that deserves respect. But as far as being called reverend, oh, you're so reverend, revered, that is not something that we find in Scripture, because we're to revere the Lord in His name. But at the same time, there is proper authority. There's biblical authority in a church of overseers having the oversight, being a shepherd and under shepherd. And so there's proper authority, but it can easily turn into excessive authority. I remember a pastor of a very large church. I don't know if you've ever heard this, or if you were the one who told me this, or if I heard it in a message somewhere. I forget. But basically, I heard of this one pastor who it was basically these people wouldn't even if they were going to buy a car, they would go to their pastor for his blessing for their choice of a purchase of a car. Do you remember that? Did you ever hear that? You heard that. It was in a message. Okay. Now, was that the person? Was he the one preaching it?
No. He had heard that from another pastor.
Oh, he heard it from another pastor. Okay. So I knew I wasn't making stuff up. That's good. But anyway, so yes, I think it's the same church, and this pastor's been dead for a number of years now, but the culture of that church, and it's one of the largest, at the time it was one of the largest Baptist churches in America, and still pretty large now. There was a man who was on staff there, and he was on faculty at the Bible college there that they have. And he would go around and he'd do financial seminars. And a lot of it was really good, really helpful. We have one on CD. And, he got in a bit of trouble. Because not only was he doing these financial seminars, he was also involved in an investment of this supposed, one of the aspects of this investment had to do with these used car dealerships where they would sell cars to people with bad credit, and they'd be charged an exorbitantly high interest. And so he says, you invest in this, and you're going to get a guaranteed whatever % rate of return. I mean, this is your guarantee. Well, the investment, the whole business started to go sour. Plus, they were selling these other guys he was involved with. They were selling unregistered or unlicensed securities, and so they were breaking some laws in that regard as far as investment laws. And so they got into some trouble. And but what was he doing though? There were literally people, and I'm thinking you're breaking the whole. You're breaking every just basic principle in investing. Is there were literally people putting their entire life savings, their retirement savings, into this investment. And there were some people who lost everything. Well, how did they get caught up into that? Because they had respect for this person who was in authority. Now, he wasn't a pastor, but he was in a high respected position. And the culture of that church and where he came from in that college was one where you don't question the man of God. So if the pastor says you need to do this, then, I mean, there's unyielding, unquestioning allegiance. Now, it's a fine line because, of course, people should not just automatically be cynical or rebellious or skeptical, but at the same time, people need to be given the liberty to think for themselves, and especially on those matters, financial matters. I can teach and preach on finances, but at the same time, it's not up to me to make your individual decisions for you. I can give you the principles, I can give you advice, and hopefully, if someone needs advice on a car purchase, or whatever, some financial issue, I'm open for, if you are seeking out advice. But that's different than me rolling over you saying, well, this is what you have to do. You better do this particular thing. But that still goes on today, and it's very subtle because they don't necessarily see it that way. But there was a missionary couple who apparently got a letter from the FBI. And by the way, this person, I think he's in prison now. and he got a letter from the FBI, and they were wanting a statement from him or basically more information regarding this particular individual. And he said, I heard him say this myself, he's like, no, we didn't answer it. Like, he just could not bring himself to implicating this person. But he was completely in the wrong. This person was completely in the wrong, was not operating. He was going around preaching about finances, and a lot of it was good. But then at the same time, he's using either bad judgment or taking advantage. I don't know if he was purposely taking advantage of people. I'm not going to assume that. But that was what happened, is there's the excessive authority. On the other hand, you have the Laodiceans, which means people's rights, and then you have churches where in the culture, church culture, where it's like the pastor is just this limp-wristed, controlled weakling because the people are going to revolt if he rubs them the wrong way. And so we got to let the power in the hands of the people. And so the biblical model and the biblical precedent is a balance between the two of having godly, strong leadership and authority in the churches, but at the same time not ruling over, not lording over God's heritage. And so, but that is what happened. It started within the congregations. Then associations were formed with presidents who exercised increasing amounts of authority over multiple churches. And then you have the distinction between elders and bishops, and that's why in the Catholic Church you have the priest, the father, and then you have the bishops or archbishops over a certain region. And so there's the distinction, where in the Bible there is no distinction between pastors, elders, and bishops. They're all the same office, and you don't have that hierarchy, that regional hierarchy. Eventually there were 5 major centers of Christianity: Rome, Constantinople, Antioch, Jerusalem, and Alexandria, the most influential places regarding Christianity. We're out of time at this point. I know I took some time addressing the other things before we got into the lesson today, so definitely a shorter lesson, and we didn't cover as much ground. But we're going to continue on this subject of corruption of church government in the budding of apostasy. As we go along here, Lord willing, next week we'll see that. We'll continue on with that subject of corruption of church government.